When we talk about a family's resistance to a relationship, the instinct is often to personalize it, to feel it as a verdict on who you are, as if their disapproval is a direct statement about your worth, your character, your suitability as a partner. But that interpretation, while emotionally understandable, is not always accurate, because in most cases, what you are encountering is not a rejection of you as an individual. It is a reaction to what you represent within a system that already has its own internal logic, values, and emotional history. Families are not neutral observers, they are systems, and like any system, they seek stability, familiarity, and continuity. So when a new person enters that system, someone who brings different values, different ways of expressing love, different expectations about independence or commitment, that system experiences disruption, and disruption often triggers resistance. Not necessarily because the new person is wrong, but because they are unfamiliar, and the human mind has a long history of mistrusting what it does not yet understand. So before asking, "Why don't they accept me?" it becomes far more useful to ask, "What exactly are they responding to?" Because resistance is rarely simple. It can be rooted in fear. Fear of losing influence over their child, fear of change, fear of being replaced. It can be shaped by cultural expectations, beliefs about marriage, religion, social compatibility, or family roles. It can be influenced by past experiences, perhaps previous relationships that ended in disappointment, conflict, or instability. And sometimes it is simply about control, not in an overt malicious sense, but in a deeply human one. A desire to protect what feels familiar, predictable, and safe. So when a family says no, they are often not saying, "We reject you as a person." They are saying, "This does not fit into the version of life we understand, and that makes us uneasy." And that distinction matters, because if you interpret their resistance as a personal rejection, your response will naturally become emotional, defensive, possibly reactive. But if you can see it as a systemic response, your approach can shift from confrontation to understanding, from "how do I defend myself?" to "how do I engage with this more thoughtfully?" This is where emotional intelligence becomes critical, because not every situation can be resolved by asserting your position more forcefully. In fact, in many cases, pushing harder without understanding the underlying concerns only deepens resistance. Instead, what creates movement is empathy paired with clarity. Empathy allows you to step into their perspective, not to agree with it, but to understand it, to see the situation through their lens, to recognize that their hesitation may not be rooted in hostility, but in attachment to what they know. And clarity allows you to remain grounded in your own position, to know who you are, what you value, and what you are willing to stand for. Because empathy without clarity leads to self-abandonment, and clarity without empathy leads to rigidity. But when the two come together, something important happens. You become both approachable and self-defined. You can say, in essence, "I understand your concerns, and I respect your perspective. And at the same time, this is who I am, and this is the relationship I am choosing." That kind of communication does not guarantee immediate acceptance, but it does create the possibility of respect. And respect is often the first step toward acceptance. Another important layer to consider is that family resistance is not static. It can evolve. Initial reactions are often the most intense. They are driven by surprise, by instinct, by a need to assert boundaries quickly. But over time, as they are exposed to consistency, stability, and sincerity, perceptions can shift, because people do not only respond to what they are told, they respond to what they observe. And if over time your behavior reflects integrity, patience, and emotional maturity, that can begin to soften resistance, not always, but often enough to matter. However, this process requires patience. And patience, in this context, is not passive waiting. It is active endurance. It is showing up consistently without becoming reactive. It is maintaining your sense of self, even in the presence of doubt or disapproval. And that is not easy, because being in a space where you are not fully accepted can trigger deep insecurities. You may begin to question your place, your worth, your future in the relationship, and if those questions are not addressed internally, they can start to shape your external behavior. You may try harder to prove yourself, to be more agreeable, to adjust your personality in ways that feel less authentic but more acceptable. And while adaptation is sometimes necessary, over-adaptation can become a form of self-erasure, because at a certain point, you are no longer trying to be accepted, you are trying to be approved. And approval, unlike acceptance, often comes at a cost. It requires you to shrink parts of yourself, to silence certain aspects of your identity, to become more aligned with expectations than with your own truth. So the real question is not just, how do I win over his family? It is, what version of myself am I willing to maintain while trying to do so? Because if acceptance requires you to abandon your authenticity, then what exactly are you being accepted for? This is where self-awareness becomes essential. Because understanding the family's resistance is not about changing who you are. It is about understanding how you are being perceived within a particular context. And that perception can often be influenced by small, meaningful shifts in how you show up. Not by becoming someone else, but by becoming more intentional, more grounded, more patient, more attuned to the dynamics at play, and at the same time, recognizing that not all resistance can or should be overcome. Because sometimes, no matter how much understanding you bring or how much effort you invest, the system you are entering is not willing to expand. And that too is information. Information that must be respected even if it is difficult to accept. So the path forward is not about forcing acceptance. It is about navigating the space between understanding and self-respect, between empathy and boundaries, between effort and self-preservation, and ultimately between the desire to belong and the need to remain true to who you are. Because in the end, the goal is not to be accepted by everyone. The goal is to be fully seen and still stand firm in your truth. And the moment you stop trying to win approval and instead begin to live with clarity and integrity, you shift the entire dynamic, not always immediately, but inevitably. And that is where real strength begins, not in being accepted, but in knowing that even if you are not, you have not lost yourself in the process. When we look at the man in this dynamic, we often underestimate how complex his position really is. From the outside, it can seem simple. He should just choose. But internally, he is navigating a web of emotional loyalties, identity expectations, and deeply ingrained beliefs about family, duty, and love. Because for many men, especially in family-centered cultures, loyalty to family is not just a value. It is a foundation of identity. It is tied to upbringing, to gratitude, to a sense of belonging. To turn away from that, or even to appear to challenge it, can feel like a form of internal betrayal. And yet, at the same time, he is forming a bond with a partner who expects not just love, but presence, not just affection, but alignment, not just words, but action. So he finds himself in the middle of two powerful forces, both of which carry emotional weight. And the question is not simply, who does he choose? The deeper question is, how does he choose? Because the manner in which he navigates this tension will determine the emotional health of the relationship far more than the choice itself. Let's consider what happens when he avoids choosing, when he delays, when he stays neutral, when he says, let's just wait and see. At first, this may feel like a responsible or considerate approach. After all, he is trying to avoid conflict. He is trying to keep both sides at peace. He is trying not to hurt anyone. But neutrality, over time, becomes its own form of communication. It signals hesitation. It signals a lack of clear direction. And, most importantly, it signals to the partner that she is not being fully prioritized. Not necessarily because she is unimportant, but because the relationship is not being actively protected. And relationships, especially under pressure, do not sustain themselves on intention alone. They require visible commitment. They require decisions that can be seen, felt, and trusted. Because love, when it is real, does not just exist in words. It exists in positioning, where you stand, what you defend, what you are willing to face difficulty for. And when that positioning is unclear, the partner is left in a state of emotional ambiguity. She begins to wonder, am I in this alone? Is this relationship something he is willing to stand for, or something he is hoping will resolve itself without him having to intervene? And those questions, if left unanswered, begin to erode trust. Not because the love is gone, but because the security of that love is uncertain. Now, from his perspective, the hesitation is often not about lack of care. It is about fear, fear of conflict, fear of disappointing his family, fear of making a decision that he cannot undo, fear of losing one relationship while trying to preserve another. And these are not irrational fears, they are deeply human. But fear, when it is not confronted, tends to shape behavior in subtle ways. It leads to avoidance, it leads to delayed conversations, it leads to partial truths, where he says just enough to maintain peace, but not enough to create clarity. And over time, this pattern creates distance, not because he is choosing to pull away, but because he is not choosing to fully engage. And the difference is significant. Because disengagement does not always look like absence, sometimes it looks like inconsistency, like emotional unpredictability, like moments of connection followed by moments of withdrawal. And for the partner, this creates confusion. She does not know what to expect. She does not know where she stands. And in the absence of clarity, she begins to rely on interpretation. She reads into pauses. She reads into tone. She reads into small changes in behavior. And when people begin to rely on interpretation instead of clarity, anxiety increases. So what is needed here is not just a decision, but leadership. And leadership, in this context, is not about control. It is about direction. It is the ability to say, this is the path I am choosing, and this is how I intend to move forward. It involves having difficult conversations with family, not aggressively, but firmly. It means expressing with respect that while their perspective matters, the final decision about his life and his relationship is his to make. And that kind of conversation requires emotional strength, because it will likely meet resistance, it may create discomfort, it may even temporarily strain relationships that have been stable for years. But avoiding that discomfort does not eliminate the tension. It simply postpones it. And postponed tension tends to grow. So leadership is not about eliminating conflict. It is about navigating it with integrity. At the same time, leadership within the relationship means showing up consistently. It means reassuring the partner, not just occasionally, but reliably. It means being transparent about the challenges, instead of shielding her from reality to avoid difficult conversations. It means making her feel like she is not just part of the relationship, but part of a shared decision-making process. Because when a person feels included, they feel valued. And when they feel valued, they invest more deeply. But when they feel like they are waiting for a decision that is being made elsewhere, they begin to detach. Not abruptly, but gradually. And that gradual detachment is often the most dangerous kind, because it happens quietly, without confrontation, without a single defining moment. Just a slow shift from closeness to distance. And by the time it becomes noticeable, something has already changed. So the question is not whether he can keep both sides happy, because often he cannot. The question is whether he is willing to take responsibility for his choice and to lead from that place. Because responsibility creates clarity, and clarity creates stability. And stability is what allows a relationship to grow under pressure instead of breaking under it. And perhaps the most important truth here is this. When a man stands firmly in his decision, communicates it with respect, and follows through with consistent action, he does not just change the outcome of the relationship, he changes the emotional experience of everyone involved. Because people do not just respond to what is decided, they respond to how it is decided. And in that difference lies the power to transform not just a relationship, but the way that relationship is lived. So the real question is not simply whether he will choose, it is whether he will choose in a way that brings clarity or continue in a way that creates confusion. And in the end, clarity is not just a gift to the partner, it is a gift to himself. Because a life without clarity is a life lived in constant negotiation. But a life with clarity, no matter how difficult the choice, becomes a life that can finally move forward. When a person chooses to stay in a relationship under this kind of pressure, we often assume it is an act of strength. And in many ways it is. But what we don't always acknowledge is that staying can also come at a cost. An emotional, psychological, and even existential cost that is not immediately visible, but accumulates over time. Because staying in uncertainty is not the same as staying in security. When a partner is not fully accepted by the family, she does not just enter the relationship, she enters a state of ongoing evaluation. She begins to wonder, consciously or unconsciously, where do I stand in this equation? And when that question does not have a clear answer, it creates a form of emotional tension that is difficult to fully resolve. Now, at the beginning, this tension may be manageable. In fact, it may even feel meaningful. There is a sense of purpose in proving oneself, in striving to be accepted, in believing that with enough time, effort, and patience, things will eventually fall into place. And to some extent, that belief can sustain a person. But the human psyche has limits, because over time, the experience of constantly trying to prove your worth can begin to shift your internal dialogue. You may start to internalize the resistance. You may begin to ask yourself, what am I doing wrong? Why is this so difficult? Why am I not being accepted? And those questions, if they remain unanswered, begin to take root. They don't just stay as thoughts, they become feelings. Feelings of inadequacy, feelings of doubt, feelings of being not enough. And this is where the emotional cost becomes deeper. Because you are no longer just navigating external resistance, you are now navigating an internal narrative that questions your value, and that is far more difficult to endure. At the same time, the relationship itself becomes a space of emotional labor. The partner may find herself constantly adjusting, adapting, and managing not just the relationship, but also the reactions around it. She may become more careful with her words, more measured in her actions, more aware of how she is perceived. And while adaptability is a strength, there is a point at which it becomes self-suppression, where you are no longer expressing yourself fully, but instead filtering yourself to reduce tension. And over time, that creates a quiet disconnect from your own identity, because every time you modify yourself to fit a situation, you are making a subtle trade-off, a little less of your authenticity in exchange for a little more acceptance. And when that happens repeatedly, the sense of self begins to shift. Not dramatically, but gradually. You may begin to feel that you are not entirely yourself in this relationship, that certain parts of you are being set aside, not because they are unwanted, but because they are not yet accepted. And that creates an internal tension, because humans have a fundamental need to feel seen, not just partially, but fully, to feel that the person they are, in their entirety, is not only tolerated but valued. And when that need is not met, it creates emotional fatigue. Now, this fatigue does not always manifest as conflict. In fact, it often manifests as silence, as emotional withdrawal, as a quiet distancing that does not come from a lack of love, but from a need to protect oneself. Because when a person feels that their place is uncertain, they begin to conserve their emotional energy. They stop investing as freely. They stop expressing as openly. They begin to hold back, not because they want to, but because they need to. And this is where the relationship begins to feel different, less spontaneous, less secure, less emotionally expansive. Not because the love has disappeared, but because the environment in which that love exists is not stable. And emotional stability is essential for connection to deepen. Without it, even genuine love begins to feel constrained. At the same time, there is another layer to this experience, the psychological toll of waiting. Because staying in a relationship where acceptance is uncertain often involves waiting for something to change, waiting for the family to approve, waiting for the partner to make a clearer stand, waiting for a moment where things finally align, and waiting, when it is open-ended, creates a particular kind of psychological strain, because it keeps you in a state of anticipation without resolution. And the human mind does not cope well with unresolved anticipation. It seeks closure. It seeks clarity. It seeks direction. Without those, it begins to generate its own interpretations. And those interpretations are often shaped by insecurity. So what might begin as patience slowly transforms into doubt. And what began as hope can quietly turn into emotional exhaustion. Now, none of this means that staying is the wrong choice. But it does mean that staying must be conscious. Because there is a difference between enduring something with awareness and enduring something while slowly losing yourself in the process. And that distinction is critical, because if you are staying, the question is not just, can I handle this? The deeper question is, what is this doing to me over time? is this experience helping me grow into a more grounded, resilient version of myself? Or is it slowly diminishing my sense of self-worth? Because relationships should not require you to constantly question your value. They should not leave you in a state where you are always proving, always waiting, always hoping that things will eventually become easier. There should be a sense of mutual recognition. A sense that, despite the external pressures, your place in the relationship is secure. And if that sense is missing, then what you are experiencing is not just external resistance, it is internal instability. And internal instability over time is what causes people to question whether they can continue. Not because they do not love the person, but because they are no longer certain of their own emotional well-being within the relationship. So the question becomes deeply personal, not just, is this relationship worth fighting for, but what am I becoming while I fight for it? Because the answer to that question often reveals more than any external circumstance ever could. And in the end, love should not require you to lose yourself in order to hold on to it. Because if a relationship asks you to abandon your sense of self, then the cost of staying may be higher than the cost of leaving. And that is the truth many people discover only after they have stayed too long. At a certain point in any relationship facing this kind of pressure, the question evolves. It is no longer just about love. It is no longer just about effort or patience or even hope. It becomes a question of discernment. Because not every relationship that is difficult is wrong, and not every relationship that is meaningful is meant to last. And the challenge is learning how to tell the difference. We often glorify persistence. We admire people who stay, who fight, who hold on despite resistance. And there is something deeply admirable about that. Commitment is not passive. It requires strength, resilience, and emotional courage. But there is another side to persistence that we don't talk about enough, because persistence without clarity can turn into endurance without direction, and endurance, when it becomes prolonged, can start to resemble self-neglect. So the real question is not just, should you stay? The deeper question is, what is staying costing you, and what is it offering you? Because every relationship, especially one under pressure, exists within a balance of cost and value. What are you giving? What are you receiving? And perhaps most importantly, are those two things in a state of growth, or are they becoming increasingly imbalanced? Now, when we talk about walking away, people often hear that as a failure, as giving up, as not trying hard enough. But in reality, walking away can also be an act of profound clarity. Because walking away is not always about rejecting the relationship. Sometimes it is about accepting a reality that cannot be changed. And there is a significant difference between those two. Because rejection is emotional, but acceptance is grounded. Rejection says, this is not good enough. Acceptance says, this is what this situation is, and I need to respond to it honestly. And that honesty is where strength lies. So how do you know when it is time to persist and when it is time to release? The answer is not always immediate, but there are signals. One of the most important is movement. Is there any forward movement in the situation? Is there progress in how the family responds over time? Is the partner becoming more clear, more decisive, more supportive in meaningful ways? Or is the situation remaining largely unchanged, with the same conversations repeating, the same tensions resurfacing, and the same uncertainties lingering? Because growth, even if slow, indicates possibility. But stagnation, especially over a long period, often indicates limitation. And while patience is important, it cannot replace progress indefinitely. Another key factor is emotional health. Ask yourself, how is this experience shaping me internally? Am I becoming more grounded, more self-aware, more emotionally resilient? Or am I becoming more anxious, more uncertain, more disconnected from myself? Because a healthy relationship, even under pressure, should not consistently diminish your sense of well-being. There will always be moments of difficulty. That is natural. But if the overall experience is one of emotional depletion, that is a signal that something is not sustainable. And sustainability is crucial, because relationships are not just about intensity, they are about longevity. And longevity requires a foundation that can hold weight over time. Now, another important element is reciprocity. Are both people equally invested in navigating the situation? Is your partner actively taking steps to address the family dynamic? Is he communicating clearly, setting boundaries, and making efforts to protect the relationship? Or are you carrying the emotional burden alone? Because imbalance in effort is one of the earliest signs that a relationship may not be sustainable in its current form. And when one person is consistently overfunctioning, taking on more emotional responsibility, more uncertainty, more adaptation, it eventually leads to burnout. Not immediately, but inevitably. And burnout is often what precedes the decision to walk away. But by the time burnout arrives, the decision has often already been made internally. Because emotionally, the person has already begun to detach. So the real work is not waiting until you reach that point. It is recognizing the patterns earlier. Another important reflection is this. Are you being chosen? Not just loved, not just cared for, but actively chosen. Because being chosen means that your partner is willing to make decisions that reflect commitment to you, even in the face of difficulty. It means that when faced with pressure, they do not disappear. They do not hesitate indefinitely. They do not leave you in a state of uncertainty. Instead, they take a position. And that position communicates something powerful. You matter enough for me to stand for this. And if that is missing, then the relationship is not just facing external pressure, it is lacking internal reinforcement. And that is a critical distinction, because external challenges can often be overcome. But internal uncertainty, if left unresolved, will eventually erode even the strongest connections. So the question becomes, is this relationship being supported from within? Or is it relying entirely on your effort to hold it together? Because love should not feel like a one-sided effort to maintain something that requires two people to sustain. And finally, there is a deeper philosophical question that sits beneath all of this. What is the relationship teaching you about yourself? Is it expanding your capacity to love, to communicate, to understand complexity? Or is it shrinking your sense of identity, your confidence, your emotional stability? Because relationships are not just about who we are with others, they are about who we become in the process. And if the relationship is bringing out a version of you that feels diminished, constantly uncertain, or emotionally exhausted, then that is not a neutral experience. It is a signal, and signals are meant to be interpreted, not ignored. So whether you choose to stay or to walk away, the most important factor is not the decision itself. It is the consciousness behind that decision. Because a conscious choice, even a difficult one, creates clarity. And clarity allows you to move forward without regret, without self-doubt, without the lingering question of, what if I had done something differently? Because at the end of the day, the goal is not just to be in a relationship. The goal is to be in a relationship that allows you to remain whole. And if that is not possible, then the question is no longer about holding on. It is about having the courage to let go. And sometimes the most powerful act of love you can offer to yourself is to choose a future that does not require you to abandon your present sense of self. Because in the end, the relationship you walk away from should never be the one that costs you your identity. It should be the one that taught you how to protect it.